Good afternoon, Lee family, and welcome to another installment of Lee Live. If you've tuned in before, welcome back. If this is your first time with us, we're so glad you're here. As a reminder, my name is Alex Staub. I get to work here at Lee in the Office of First Year Programs, and we're so glad again that you're joining us for this Lee Live episode. Throughout the past 3 weeks or so, we have been on a difficult journey together. Our very way of life has been challenged and stretched in the ways that we've been forced to wrestle with a new normal of social distancing and self-isolation. We're facing tensions of both creating routine for our lives, things like Zoom classes, virtual chapels, morning rituals, and more, and an incredible, indescribable discomfort that at times I certainly don't even know what to do with. There are tensions between the present need for hope and a nagging negativity of loneliness and despair, and undoubtedly a sense of loss that we're experiencing. Yet over the past few weeks, we've danced around some of these topics for our Lee Live episodes. Our first week, before we even knew how long this would carry on or the severity of it, we discussed a whole picture of wellness. If you remember, we had 3 wonderful panelists sharing about how we can be well during this time. They encouraged us to engage with our present situation in responsible, healthy ways, rather than recede into the hollowness of avoidance. Last week, we took a look at some helpful tips about maintaining routine and working to be successful as academic students and what this new college thing means in the world of Zoom. Now, we want to preface with the fact that this week's episode may not be the most sunshiny of topics. No one's getting an egg broken on their head this week. We're talking about grief and loss. This week, we want to have a pointed conversation about those tensions that I mentioned earlier. We want to name those feelings and experiences, and we want to move towards meaning, towards making meaning, and towards hope building, if you will. You may have seen a recent article floating around from the Harvard Business Review. It's an interview with a leading expert on grief, David Kessler. In it, Kessler explores the grief that we're feeling, how we can manage it, and how we might work together to make that meaning in the midst of it. Today, we've invited one of our own experts to the show to discuss exactly what this means for all of us. And therefore, it's my pleasure to go ahead and introduce David Qualiana. He's a licensed psychologist. He's the director of our counseling center, a theologian, professor in our psychology department, and husband to Dr. Heather Qualiana, a full-time psychology professor here at Lee that many of us know. Dr. Qualiana, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Why don't we go ahead and jump into this conversation with referring back to what we talked about a couple weeks ago. We talked about this with our wellness panel, but specifically from a mental health perspective, what are some possible reactions that people are experiencing during this time?
Sure. In responding to that question, I would even start with categories of reactions that we might be having, how to describe maybe dichotomies or different categories of reaction. I think there are some pretty universal or common reactions that many, if not all of us, are having. I think at the same time, there are some very unique, diverse, particular responses, reactions that people might be having. There are comfortable emotions and experiences and uncomfortable ones. And you'll notice I'm not calling those positive or negative because there are negative, maybe unhealthy, destructive, ineffective reactions that we have. And there are positive ones that might be more honest and genuine. They might give us more long-term benefit for coping and working through our experience. And honestly, I think some of those positive reactions are the more uncomfortable ones rather than comfortable ones sometimes. I think we have relational reactions, we have conscious and unconscious reactions. So there's so many different categories. Specifically, one of the things that I've been hearing from a lot of students is that their experience, their reaction is stress. I'm feeling stressed, maybe uncomfortable, frustrated, annoyed, but something about stress and busyness. I would encourage people to try to go a little bit further with that. I would argue that feeling stress is simply acknowledging that in one way or the other, you're having an uncomfortable experience or reaction. But if we can go beneath that stress and identify stress how, what emotion word might go with that, what experiences might go along with that, we can go from that vague stress experience into a more specific description of what our experience might be. I know that a lot of people are noticing this loss of routine, structure, absence of whatever their normal was. And yet, at the same time, I would argue that even in your intro describing these existential changes that we're going through, I think a lot of people might be having a reaction that says, well, that's not really me, that's not my experience. And perhaps that is the case, and we can be grateful for that. But I think there are other people who, if you look through Kubler-Ross's stages of grief that Kessler talks about, maybe what you're dealing with is actually more of a response of denial or deflection or minimizing, that perhaps you are having more of a change, more of a negative reaction than you're acknowledging to yourself, but you're shoulding yourself into, I shouldn't have that reaction, it shouldn't be this way, something along those lines. Especially if maybe you think other people are overreacting and their impact on you just shouldn't be there and we should get back to normal. Perhaps we can't get back to normal, but we want to, and so we turn that wish into should in a way that's kind of denying the reality and the lack of control that we have sometimes. I think denial to reactivity can look like numbing, staying busy, keeping busy, substances, screens, sleep, food, and pleasure. I think those can be some ways that we're reacting that might be more survival-based than they are truly working through and noticing our difficult experiences. I think some people are really reaching out for control, predictability, answers, data, those kinds of things, which to some extent, I think we all ought to be looking for. But to another extent, there's an illusion of control and peace that comes from those kinds of answers, and we need to know the balance there. Certainly, there's a lot of expressing, acting out, so to speak, that might be happening. Anger or frustration is an experience that I think a lot of us have. I wonder if that is the primary emotion, though, or if there are other more vulnerable emotions underneath. Maybe that's confusion, fear, powerlessness, loneliness, despair, disengagement, apathy, something along those lines. I think we have spiritual responses too. In this time, our faith can help us see beyond the current moment and experience to truths that we know about the past, present, and future. But at the same time, there's this ugly version of the same that is not true. There's a spiritual bypass that people might engage in sometimes. If we use certain religious language and scripts and deliverance and those kinds of ideas to simply avoid noticing and working through the difficulties that we are experiencing. So we want to notice whether we are finding true hope and peace through what God would actually give us in these moments versus we're lying to ourselves with spiritual bypass language so that we don't have to deal with the brutal difficulties of our reality. And I'm sure there are other reactions that people are having, but that's maybe just a list.
Absolutely. And that laundry list that you mentioned, a lot of us would probably categorize those reactions and those responses as uncomfy or uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I love what Kessler talks about in this article specifically. He offers the idea that this discomfort we're experiencing can really be boiled down in many ways to grief or mourning. And specifically in that realm of grief and mourning, Dr. Pollyanna, there are a lot of emotional and even physical effects. What are some things that we can do to manage and perhaps even move through those effects in healthy ways?
Yeah, I think I've already implied that maybe the first thing is simply noticing and acknowledging that we are dealing with some sort of, whether you want to use the language grief or not, I think it's a good word, but grief, suffering, adversity, disequilibrium, those kinds of things. I've heard it described that Suffering might be another word for it. Suffering exists in the gap in between our expectations and our experience. And so when expectations and experience don't match each other, there is suffering there, there's grief there. So I think the first thing is noticing, acknowledging, because anything that we censor or we ignore or we deny, we can't work through. But if we actually notice it, we acknowledge it, then we can start working on it. Whether it's Kessler, Kubler-Ross, others within psychology and therapy, I think one of the main things that we want to look at is not trying to find that one answer or response that is going to help, but instead we find that uneasy and ever dynamic balance, tension, sometimes between opposing forces. Within our faith, I think the serenity prayer is a really good example of that. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and most importantly, the wisdom to know the difference between the two. Sometimes you even I take the can out and replace it with a sometimes dangerous word, should, to have the serenity to accept the things that I should accept, to change the things that I should change, because sometimes we can take control over something, but it doesn't mean that's the wisest thing for us to do. So looking at the difference between can and should there, perhaps. There are other balances we look for, the positive versus the negative. Some people are focusing on the positive so much in order to find hope that they have this false optimism that Stockdale actually talks about in the Stockdale paradox, that places hope maybe in the wrong things, and they're only focusing on the positive, they're in denial of the negative, and so they're not adequately informed for truly how to respond. I think other people are really stuck on the negative, the changes and the loss, and they're unable to see beyond that. So if we can find a balance of acknowledging the negative and yet contextualizing that within the positive. And similar contextualization can happen with past, present, and future. Are we dwelling on the past and regret about it? Are we anxious about the future? Or are we spending some time simply noticing what our present experience is? We could do the same with logic versus emotion. We can do the same with verbal versus nonverbal, which is one that we adults don't talk about all the time. We're so used to using our words, either in our head or using words in our expression to other people. What about those nonverbal forms of expression? Emotion, crying, screaming, laughing, creative expression like music and art, bodily expressions, maybe the really simple basic ones like sleep or exercise or eating, but also dance and play and those other types of bodily expressions. There are so many different ways to work through all of these things. I think back to that idea of present-mindedness as opposed to being stuck in the past or dwelling only upon the future. We can have some really basic ways of doing that are simple to describe, but perhaps not so simple to practice and to live in. And even using the 5 senses to notice, like, what do I see in this room? The red light on the prompter here, noticing the space in between us. What am I hearing, smelling, touching, and feeling? That can really bring us into the room that actually is probably a safer place than what the world and the future might feel like. And so we can find some grounding and some relief in that safe here and now experience. I think there are many other ways that we can reflect on this. Compassion, flexibility, and patience, not just for other people, but self-compassion. Those of you who struggle with perfectionism, what a great opportunity to challenge some of that perfectionism and those control needs and things like that. So I could go on, but balance after we look at acknowledging the reality of our situation, not just the negative, but the negative and the positive and all these other tensions, balances.
Absolutely, and I love this touch point on emotions as well in our acknowledgement. And one of the things I love that Kessler says is, first, once we recognize those emotions, we move through them. And he says emotions need motion in many ways. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important for us not to just put those emotions on a shelf or just stay in the midst of them, but how do we move through them together specifically?
It's actually one of the lessons I've learned from so many of my clients. I actually had a client say once, and I've totally stolen this from my client, and I use it all the time, the only way out of it is through it.
I love that.
And that's hard, but I think it's wise and it's a necessary process.
I love that. And it can be difficult to move through it, especially at this time when we're being asked to social distance and self-isolate. And grief itself that we're experiencing can be isolating as well. So, Dr. Qualian, I'm curious from your perspective, how can we connect meaningfully in the midst of these hardships?
Yeah. My wife has one particular talking point on this. She's done a lot of training for parents and how to work with their kids. And she says that social distancing can't mean, we don't want it to mean social disconnection. And so I think it is important for us to strive for connection, maybe even reconnection or new and different forms of connection. Now, initially, I thought my response to this was going to be like trying to brainstorm all these creative ways that we can use the internet and social media and Zoom and whatever else to stay connected to people that we were previously connected to, or to regain connections. I've gotten a whole lot of Facebook requests for making friends with people that I've known for a long time. But honestly, I want to turn it on its head, partially because you guys are digital natives and you know more about that stuff than I do, but also because I think we have an opportunity for something very different we might not be thinking of. Rather than just turning to screens and social media and internet, which frankly, they stimulate dopamine in the brain, this pleasure center in the brain that we're kind of addicted to these days. You see all of the discussion about social media or gaming addictions. Perhaps we have an opportunity for a dopamine detox. Maybe we have an opportunity to reset and to look in other places, other directions, and turn some of these obstacles actually into opportunities. So what if the connection that we focus on for some period of time, some aspect of this social distancing, what if the connection is to ourselves? What if we're trying to connect to our own experience in a new, different, richer kind of way? What about focusing on that connection to God? We have had many things stripped away from us, and yet it has happened in a period of Lenten reflection. Are we taking Lent seriously? Are we doing what a lot of liturgical traditions do to intentionally remove something that we're used to so that when we notice its absence, it focuses us on relationship with God. It focuses us on preparing for the Good Friday and Easter story. I think we have an opportunity for these things being stripped away to point us to that spiritual reflection, relationship with God on Good Friday and Easter. There are so many other things that we can connect or reconnect to as well. What about nature? What about quiet and silence? What about connecting to noticing, simplicity, rest, listening, observing? There are so many narrow and deep things that we can try to connect to instead of our typical broad, surface level busyness connection. My 8-year-old daughter and I have started reading through the Little House on the Prairie book, maybe book series. We'll see how far we get. But I was intentional in choosing those because over 100 years ago with wagons and obviously a lack of phones and internet and all that kind of thing, life was different back then. And how did people live and how did their time and their experience go? And it's an opportunity for my daughter to see that her loss of her normal may not be as big a deal as she thinks it is because there were other people who had never had that normal to begin with. For what it's worth, that device that we all have in our pockets, this thing does make phone calls, and maybe we don't just text and do social media, but we do this audio connection in real time with people, especially with old people like me, your parents, your grandparents. That is how they prefer to connect. Maybe there's some richer and deeper connection that we can have with people through those audio calls. But I would encourage you, in addition to finding creative ways to find what you have lost with social media, with the internet, what if we find the things that we as a society have lost and reconnect to God, nature, silence, ourselves in this time of social distancing?
Absolutely, a wonderful and a necessary reminder of the simplicity with which we can engage during this time and this Lenten season of preparation. Dr. Qualiana, I want to thank you for coming on today and sharing some of your advice and thoughts with us. I hope this is helpful to you guys at home, and as we persist in these conversations and move through these emotions and recognize, acknowledge the experiences that we're having, and find creative ways to continue connecting that might be beyond our screens, that might be in other ways. Next up, it's my pleasure to introduce one of our own students, Kirsten Griffin. Kirsten is a senior nursing major. She's had a lot of involvements across campus, and we're excited to hear from her perspective about how she's working through and navigating this time of meaning making and hope. Now, Kirsten, thanks so much for joining us. If you could just start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you're doing.
Yeah, thanks for asking. So like you said, Kirsten, I'm a senior nursing major, and I'm a part of the Student Leadership Council as well, have been for the past 4 years. And I'm doing all right. It is wild to me still that a virus that we heard about in the news months ago has made it all the way to Bradley County. I'm from this area. And so realizing that has been a whole process. Realizing that we aren't coming back to campus has been a whole process, especially transitioning to online classes and finding those new routines, finding new ways to stay focused have been a journey with some highs and some lows for sure.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
and there's been a lot of loss of those former routines and former experiences. And another student, Aaron Campbell, who many of you might know, actually shared a heartfelt post this past week, and in it he shared this from the student perspective. He said, "Please give us time and space to mourn. Be gracious to students as we mourn the loss of time, the loss of relationships, the loss of community, the loss of routine, the loss of a home. Though it may seem like we often complain and begrudgingly walk through our days as students, we are mourning so many losses." And I think it's safe to say that we all are mourning many losses right now, and that's not to minimize the experiences that we're having. But Kirsten, if you're comfortable sharing, would you mind sharing some of the things that you're grieving or perhaps mourning during this time?
No, definitely not being physically on campus. There's that loss of connection. Not being able to be with the communities I've spent 4 years investing in, and not being able to see them on a day-to-day basis has really, that's a blow, and I think we're all feeling that. Nursing itself is a very communal major, especially your senior year with your cohort. You are spending 3-hour lectures together in the same room. You are spending 8-hour clinical days together. And so we really depend on each other. We really lean on each other to get to finals, to make it through, and not having those study groups, kind of feeling like you're forging your way by yourself is, that's a scary thought. I have been surprised that I would trade sleeping in to go back to clinicals. Which, I mean, it's a good thing that I do miss it, but before spring break, we were spending like 3 days a week in hospital settings or in simulations, and we were taking care of patients, and we were following nurses and desperately trying to learn all the things we need to know before we get out there in the real world. And so not having that is a real shift in routine. So just in general, I miss gathering with the people that I love and doing things that we really care about. You know this, but Great Strides was canceled, delayed till the fall, and so I know a lot of people who we were expecting to have more weeks together, several more weeks together, and so not having time to do those lasts has been something that we're all just kind of trying to figure out.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing honestly and openly, and I also want to publicly say thank you for serving as a nurse, at least for a short time during this time. I know there were a lot of questions, a lot of unknowns, and walking into that hospital every day for clinicals was not an easy task. So thank you for taking that upon yourself and leading in those ways as well. In the midst of those feelings, Kirsten, how practically have you been making meaning of those?
What I am trying to let this time do is help me realize what I find most important. I think in the midst of hustling and being really busy and having a lot of places to go, we can forget why we do what we do. And so taking this time to see what I'm really missing and what I'm really mourning, to let that signal what's important in my life. So missing being with students, I think we can all say that maybe prior to this, being in a really crowded space or trying to fight people for seats in chapel, we would complain and we would kind of have some grudges, some negative feelings about that. But now we would give anything to be packed into the PCSU or packed into the CAF. And so I think that shows how much togetherness and closeness really shapes our Lee experiences. And I think that's something that, in the future when we do get to have that in some way, we don't know what the future looks like, but I think that helps us know that closeness is something that we're all missing right now. And then missing clinicals is kind of a hopeful thing because I will have the rest of my life to kind of make up for this lost time, but it will always be really grounding to be able to look back and remember when I couldn't do that safely, like when in the hospital was the last place you wanted to be. So that has been really encouraging, and I'm also just kind of trying to remember that when we do get to reunite, all these reunions will be really beautiful. We're all experiencing a lot of the same feelings right now, and even though we're really far apart, I think we will, in some really strange and beautiful ways, be bound together, have new connections, just based on this once-in-a-lifetime experience. So,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You bringing up those reunions makes me think of our first chapel when we come back together,
Oh, yeah.
or our first opportunity to see each other in the dorms again. That itself gives me hope and excites me as well. In the midst of developing and building that hope, what has given you deep hope in life amidst these hardships?
Actually, it makes me think of something that Brittany Gates said in the first Lee Live, with this whole idea of gratitude kind of being this counter against stress. And I know we're all feeling the stress of all different kinds right now. But we still have technology. I still have connection to my community, and they are providing a lot of accountability and encouragement in a time where we're all kind of lacking on that motivation and lacking that sense of direction. And so still having that connection, I'm just increasingly more grateful for them. Having the time to kind of slow down and to be at home more has given me the chance to reflect. I'm definitely not the Kirsten who stepped onto campus 4 years ago, and I have my peers, my mentors to thank for that. And so even though we're not together right now, I have more time to think about what they really mean to me, and plenty of ways that I can reach out and let them know that they do mean that to me. With technology, I know that I'm not alone in my questions because I see people posting all the same questions all the time. As kind of a global community, everyone is learning to how to be uncertain and how to not be in control. And so that's giving me hope, knowing that God holds the answers right now. And we are just kind of, we're walking through this as one big global community. Additionally, seeing faculty and staff really just work twice as hard to make sure students are supported right now. I know I've been getting a lot of messages from my professors, saying we're praying for you, we're really trying to figure out the Zoom thing. We want you to know that you have all the support you had before and more. But just because you're at home doesn't mean that you're trying to figure this out by yourself. And so that has given me a lot of hope to see people rooting for us from afar has been really encouraging.
Absolutely. We are rooting for you, and
Yeah.
we're cheering you on. Last question for you, Kirsten, and just kind of a last note for the folks who might be watching. What's something that you would say to encourage our Lee family right now, and specifically to encourage your peers?
I would say that you are seen. That's something that's always encouraged me. It's really easy right now to feel isolated, to feel invisible, to feel like no one's seeing you or your doubts or your grief in a really scary time. But I would just want people to know that God knows your doubts, and God, He sees you, He sees your fears, and I would tell people not to hesitate to reach out if they feel like they need to talk to someone, because the odds are the person on the other end of the line really needs it too. They need a reminder that they're not alone. And so this is a really unique time where we get to be lifelines for each other, and we get to find creative ways to be there for each other. And I just kind of had this idea in my head that if we kind of just closed our eyes and just kind of listened hard, we could hear that. We could hear those prayers. We could hear that desire to be connected, even in a time when we're all social distancing. So
Absolutely. Kirsten, thank you so much for sharing vulnerably and honestly and openly and hopefully as well. I think your words spoke to my heart today and mean so much to me, and I know they mean so much to others as well. I'd like to echo Kirsten's final thoughts. You are seen, and we are here. One final note that our offices are open and here to help you, whether they're open from our homes, whether they're open from our physical offices, we're here to help you, whether that be academic support or, as Kirsten said, someone to talk to. Please reach out. We are here and we are available. As we were talking, as we were conversing, I thought of a recent article from N.T. Wright, who's a theologian and an author that many of us might know. He recently wrote an article for Time talking about these ideas of wanting answers and wanting to look for something amidst this time. But I believe that his reflection on the Psalms and biblical tradition in this article, he speaks of lamentation, and I think it's timely for our conversations about grief and hope, because in the mix of lamentation, there is wonderful grief and hope. In it, he says this: the mystery of the biblical story is that God also laments. It is not part of the Christian vocation, then, to be able to explain what's happening and why. In fact, it's part of the Christian vocation not to be able to explain and to lament instead. He goes on to offer a perspective that lamentation and lamenting is a communal factor, that God himself laments, although he might have all the answers. Friends, I want to encourage us in saying that we must grieve together. Not necessarily cling to a false hope and answers that might not be there, not disengage from each other and disengage from the discomfort that we're experiencing, not put those emotions on a shelf, not give up in hopelessness, but lament together in the hope of God's healing love, hope in the truth of Christ Jesus, a truth that can transform our understanding, where new possibilities, where new kindness, where new connection, where new care, and where new love might flourish. Thank you all. We'll see you next week.